We are walking on a graveyard of languages. These were the words of Ganesh Devi, a literary scholar who led the most extensive survey ever conducted of languages spoken across India. According to him, while in 1961, there were 1,652 identified mother tongues in India, by 2017, this had gone down to under 800 languages. There was a sense of urgency and alarm in his message. If something was not done soon, many more, up to 400 Indian languages would be lost, and with them the centuries of cultural heritage they embody. Of course, predictions of such doom for obscure rural and tribal languages spoken in remote corners of the vast subcontinent mean nothing for the average Indian. In fact, many would see this as a positive step towards assimilation of backward people into the mainstream. For some, the large number of vernaculars is a sign of fragmented, primitive society lacking the national consciousness necessary to propel India into greatness. While the right wing is keen to subsume all of India into the Hindi sphere, many sections of the liberal elite have already accepted English as the de facto lingua franca. It's not to say that the language doesn't matter to Indians. From the very inception of the nation, the question of language has loomed large. And despite all efforts to suppress them, the linguistic identities of people have remained strong. Yet strangely, the love for mother tongue does not lead to empathy and respect towards the languages of other groups. The disproportionate political space given to toxic language wars, such as Urdu versus Hindi or Hindi versus Tamil, gives the impression that our society values its inherited languages highly. But is that true? If yes, then should we be concerned about the dire predictions? Or should we simply accept the language death as a natural process of evolution towards fewer, more widely spoken languages? Isn't language just a medium of communication? So why such fuss over the death of language when other languages such as Hindi or English could serve that function just as well? We decided to pose these questions to one of the most distinguished linguists in the world. Dr. Gregory Anderson is the president at the Living Tongues Institute for Endangered Languages, based in the United States. He specializes in languages of Siberia and the tribal languages of India and has published widely in the various fields of linguists. Welcome, Dr. Anderson, to Argumentative Indians.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
We are honored to have you with us. So before we go into some of the questions that we want to explore in this session, I wanted to ask you, is it normal that a country would have 800 languages or like a few years ago, 1,500 languages? Is that a normal thing?
Well, of course, a number as high as 1,500 or even 800 is not normal across the world, although it's not unprecedented. So Papua New Guinea and Indonesia have similar numbers of languages. Nigeria also, like India, is in the many hundreds. So these are a few other countries too. Tanzania is another, Brazil, of course. These are countries with very large numbers of different ethnic groups. And the original surveying that Ganesh Devi was referring to included a lot of things that wouldn't necessarily be considered languages of India. Like I believe Finnish was on that list. So I think they did a very thorough survey of the population and included any language people living in India then might have spoken. And so that included a number of like clearly immigrant languages, right? But and also the complicated issue of whether a particular speech variety would be classified as a dialect or a language had some role in those numbers and still does today. But the actual reality is that no one really knows how many languages are spoken in India even today in 2023. So it may be more, it may be less.
So what is the difference? Like what makes something a language and what makes it a dialect? Because I see like a lot of people, when they refer to India, they say India is a land of many dialects. And even many Indian people when they're abroad, they would say something like, we've got many dialects back home. What makes something like, what makes Portuguese and Spanish separate languages versus say Hindi and Bhojpuri being a dialect? Well, some people would see that as a dialect of Hindi.
Right. a large portion of those differentiations in the popular mindset have to do with history and basically the success of a particular group seizing power at some level, whether it's micro or macro level, and promoting that language, that speech variety as a separate and distinct speech variety, which over time becomes codified and sort of accrues status as a language. Now, the flippant answer that linguists usually give when someone asks is, what's the difference between a language and a dialect? And this answer encompasses more or less what I was saying, is a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So once you have a state apparatus associated, or whether it's around a kingdom or a republic or whatever the actual political structure is, then that speech variety can be promoted, standardized and promoted. But even like macro languages like Hindi on an obvious level, and other ones that you just mentioned there, Spanish and Portuguese, they aren't monolithic. They aren't one entity per se. So like there's a lot of varieties of Spanish. So just because you speak Castilian European Spanish doesn't mean you understand Cuban Spanish. So these are, and you could say, well, those are separate languages. And I was going to say that's the actual criterion that you can apply to a certain degree with some rigor across speech varieties is, can speakers of X when speaking X understand speakers of Y when speaking Y? And if they do, then they're probably dialects of the same language. And if they don't, they're probably separate languages, okay? But there are some complicating factors there, so that there are a few instances, for example, in one particular where in New Guinea, where we were testing mutual intelligibility. So we recorded in one village downstream. They said they can't speak the language of the people upstream, but the people upstream claimed they could speak the language of the people downstream. As it turns out, they couldn't really speak it, but they could understand it. So A could not understand B, but B could still understand A. So that was one-way mutual intelligibility. What is that? Okay. Are those two separate languages? Are those just two dialects that are so divergent that they're becoming separate languages? That's probably the historical answer, is that eventually another 2 or 3 or 4 generations will pass, and that the one-way bilingualism part will start to fade, and that they really will become separate languages, assuming these languages which are at risk will be maintained for 3 or 4 generations, which is not actually likely to happen in that particular case. So that full differentiation won't get to happen because of language endangerment processes.
So the fact that like it's the state entity which sort of brings the language status versus
right.
Sort of,
it could be without a state power structure. It could be just local kind of dominance that allows them to have the political clout in some sense to assert their own identity. But so there's a very strong socio-political aspect of determining what one speech variety is called a language. Essentially what happens is one speech variety attains that status, it gets called the language, and then all the things that are diverge from that status, that one in some features, whether it's sound systems or particular words or whatever, those get called dialects of that language. And it's some of those dialects fade out far enough away where you're dealing now with separate, closely related languages. And that's probably what happened in the differentiation of Spanish and Portuguese over time. So in the Spain-Portugal border area, there are people that speak varieties that are, is it Spanish? Is it Portuguese? Who knows? Same thing happens in Northern Europe with German and Dutch. Low German very gradually slides into Dutch. And so you have at the literal borders, in some cases now political borders, you find these sort of mishmashes, or not quite one, not quite the other. And those are very difficult. Now, if they're within the political boundaries, they'll probably identify with the state language of the one or the state language of the other. So there's a variety of kind of social political things that play into people's understanding of what their own speech variety is.
So would it be fair to assume that because India has remained, the political power in India has remained mainly decentralized for most of its history, which is why we've managed to have a continuation, at least still so many languages, whereas in other parts of the world, probably these languages sort of got eliminated with centralized power, imposing one language over larger and ever larger communities.
You're still dealing with a large number of languages, but yes, that's still, even under that understanding, you're still going to get a lot of languages in India.
Yeah, because there's because they're like 6 language groups still, right? So they don't even have a common ancestor. So you cannot say that Dravidian or Munda languages, as you've studied, or the Indo-European languages, they're not result of fragmentation. They're all entirely coming from different sources as well.
Right. Within the, yes, at that macro level, they're entirely unrelatable to each other. That sort of splintering happened within each group to give you the different languages of the different families, and that often unfolded over thousands of years. So, given that India has been populated a long time, it has had decentralized power zones, as you said. That allows you, that's the same reason why we have multiple languages in places like Nigeria, New Guinea, Indonesia, because there are decentralized power areas, and that allowed for the natural fragmentation of languages. And in New Guinea, you also have lots of different language families or phyla. So that also.
Is that not the case with China, for example? Because I'm
no,
just
it
comparing.
Is the case with China. Actually, China has China is very different because China has this concept of official minority, and so they only recognize the official minorities as having languages. Okay, they basically, that's state-imposed language construction, if you will. Okay, and then they throw in all these different groups that they perceive as being similar to the large group they call the official minority. But for example, in the Tibetan minority in China, you have a bunch of groups of languages that belong to what they call the Chiangic or Jalrongic branch of Trans-Himalayan. So they're not closely related to Tibetan in any way. They're no more related to Tibetan than English is to Hindi, which is at a deep, long level. They're related. They're both Indo-European, much like these so-called Tibetan dialects in China have about that many thousands of years different from Tibetan proper. Okay, so China, again, no one has any idea how many languages there are in China. Estimates run around 250 to 300, something like that. It may well be something like 500 or 600 because there's a lot of fractured micro communities, many of whom are shifting to Mandarin right now, especially in southern China. Near the sort of Southeast Asian border zone. So yeah, China probably is just, that's a state constructed understanding of ethnicity, which ultimately in the case of China derives from Marxist and specifically Stalinist understanding of ethnicity.
But isn't like our current structure in India with 22 scheduled languages, which are sort of like the result of political backing for those coming from different states, and the languages which split across states don't really make it to that
historically accidental, badly placed, yes.
Yeah, so, and they sort of fall into the oblivion as sort of some sort of ambiguous vernaculars spoken by people. But so would it be fair to assume that like this is a natural process of evolution as we moved from smaller tribes to larger clans to eventually to kingdoms and then to these colossal states like China and India? The number of languages spoken constantly reduces and reduces and reduces because you are forming bigger political entities. So this is part of like civilizational evolution. So there is nothing to worry about. These languages are going to keep reducing over time as the communities are getting bigger. And as we move towards a global community, as a lot of people like to use the term global community, we are going to move towards very few languages at a global level. So this collapse of language is not going to be limited to India. It's kind of like it's a global thing.
Yeah, the short answer is no. These are not free will choices that minority communities in a stacked hierarchy of identities correlated to language practices are given. They're not given a free choice. Basically, the higher ups always want to have the lower downs in this hierarchy speak their language. So it's convenient for, if you take it from the state perspective, it's convenient for state administrative purposes to have one language. It doesn't mean it's actually convenient for the people. In fact, it's detrimental to the people for precisely the reason that the states are promoting a zero-sum game ideology of language diversity. It's like, it can't be X, it must be Y. You have to not speak X and Y. It has to be either X or Y, and Y we don't like, so it really has to be either X or X. Those are the choices that these communities are given. So rather than, because the ideology of monolingualism, in a sense, which I know most people in India would find somewhat odd to say that there's an ideology of monolingualism, but that's precisely what the state promotion of a language like Hindi is trying to strive for. Now, you have this extra thing with Indian English, all right, which is sort of, in a way, superordinate to to Hindi, but that's really for transnational issues, perhaps, because it's unlikely that the large major ethnic groups of southern India will really ever accept Hindi. And what we find in post-colonial states often is that, as awful as the colonial language memory of the colonial era is, the colonial language doesn't have the same sort of oppressive, ethnically oppressive baggage that another language spoken in the same country being imposed on them is or has. So that it's a lesser of two evils, in a sense, for the people's choice there. If they're going to have a language from afar imposed, it might as well be from really afar, which has greater outreach, because you can't really argue that today in 2023 English has a greater outreach globally than Hindi does. Okay, that's, you'd be deluding yourself if you thought otherwise. As important and large a language as Hindi is, okay, it just doesn't, on the global sphere and the global market of languages, it's nowhere near the rank of English. So, the reductionist view of, if you're going to take a truly utilitarian, it's all just for communication view, you should get rid of all the languages in India and everyone should just speak English. I doubt many Indian people actually would agree with that as a presence, but let's just review history, and even English its hegemony right now is unlikely to last forever. So 100 years ago, the language of international communication and education was French, basically. You had to know French to be an educated global citizen. Now that language is basically English. If we go back further, and very few people are learning French as a foreign language now in many countries. The rate of French learning has just gone down, crazily. We can go back in history and we can look at, for example, great empires of the ancient Near East, like Sumerian, for example. They were top dogs for a while. What happened was they got conquered by the Akkadians, and then their language ceased to exist, and the Akkadian language became the language of that state. What happened? Well, eventually the Akkadians lost power, and the same area was essentially conquered by other speaking groups. Ultimately, the Hittites became the dominating power in Anatolia. But what is the consequence of all of that? They all ruled for centuries. Their languages were sort of at the top of, for their mind, the economic world. And all of them resulted in being kicked out by another top dog, and that language ceasing to exist. Okay, so this is what happens when you go with the zero-sum game, is that the language that you keep replacing higher and higher languages. So it's, to say you don't care about linguistic diversity in India means that you're okay with having your grandchildren maybe speak only English and never be able to communicate with you if you don't speak English, because that's the natural progression of this. You can't really cherry pick what the let's just stop it at everyone speaking Hindi. We're not going to go on to the next logical level of assimilation. And the other issue with that same question, which is this fallacy of monolingualism, that somehow if everyone speaks just one language, and that's the same one language, we'll all harmonically, magically get along. And all you have to do is look at any kind of political discourse in any country between two rival factions who speak the same language to understand that you don't see eye to eye on any issue necessarily just because you share a language. So there is no magical getting out, wrinkling out of all the, flattening out all the wrinkles of conflict by having, someone speak the same language. So the idea here is that you want to have people should be able to speak multiple languages, which is not saying that they shouldn't have to, use Hindi or use English in the appropriate context, because people can be quadrilingual. It's not impossible for people to speak 3 or 4 languages, as many people in India do today. So
I was just going to say that we see the pressures towards what you just described, pressures towards monolingualism tend to be much more prominent in authoritarian regimes. We obviously remember Spain during the dictatorial years, when so much effort was invested in suppressing all the other languages of Spain. But in India's context, I think even now, as India being a nominal democracy, even the people who want to impose Hindi, they still want it to be imposed as a link language, not as a mono. They don't want to make it, they're not arguing for monolingualism. They're asking for bilingualism, with Hindi being as the link language across India. And then the others will have a fair argument. And why not have a link language that links us to the whole world, as opposed to just linking it across India? So why English could just serve the purpose as well. But I wanted to actually, but I thought your point about the hegemony of English not lasting forever was actually quite interesting, because it just reminded me that at some point the status that English has today was actually held by Persian for several centuries in India. And it was the language of prestige and to look elite and educated. And now it's disappeared without a trace. It's almost like puzzling that how could a language be so important across the entire subcontinent and it's gone without a trace. Most people don't even remember that that used to be the language of you wouldn't be considered educated if you didn't know fluent Persian.
That's part of the subtractive ideology that permeates the language market in the construction of power bases. It has to do with, they fell out of power. So why maintain the language, right? There's absolutely no reason to keep it because it's not associated with a prestige society any longer.
Yeah, but I think the risk in India's case, like, so there is obviously the authoritarian way where you eliminate a language by imposing strict monolingualism, which is the case, has been the case in many parts of the world. But I think there is also the risk where you bring in multilingualism or bilingualism, but one language had so much more state-backed power through, like we see today with administrative jobs, with all the educational institutions endorsing it. So the other language, even if it's not eliminated by force, it just becomes redundant over time. It's not serving any purpose.
It shouldn't, right? So this is the reason that it does is because the speaker communities who are devalued so much have internalized that negative attitude towards their own identity. And thus they see it as a way to try to eliminate at least one vector of discrimination against them. And that's why you often find parents encouraging their children to learn the whatever language it is, Hindi or going to, in the case of many Hindi speakers who have the means, sending them to English language schools or whatever. So, you have this sort of, again, you're always sensitive to these issues, but so why would you want to maintain that language? Well, who when you talk to your or think about your dead relatives, your dead grandparents, your great grandparents, they weren't speaking this new language. How on earth are you going to speak to them? What is your language of your cultural songs and jokes, riddles, these things? As anyone knows, humor doesn't translate well across languages. Sometimes, certainly puns by definition are only funny in the language that they're meant to be for. And so you lose all of the songs, all of the stories, all of this, because you can't really translate these things across languages. And it's all because you feel that your identity, that what you do in your private time, like with your family at over a meal, have nothing to do with interactions with other communities. So on that micro level, you still, if you choose to abandon your identity in that context, it's because you have been told or given this choice that says, either X or X, as I said before. It's like there's not X or Y, it's either X or X. And so it's, we only need to learn the language of this power. But, the fact that you go to school in this language or you do banking in that language, that shouldn't have anything to do with what you do to communicate with your own family as a choice. That they aren't, there's separate environments because people can be bilingual, right?
It does shrink the space where that language is used. And hence, because you never read medical reports in that language, you're not filing your petitions in that language. So the vocabulary then that you use in that language shrinks over time.
Well, it could, or it could not. You could choose to develop language development. Programs develop, for example, very few languages have terms for all these things. Most of them had to either organically develop or borrowed them from languages that already did have these terms. So this is a natural process of language. So yeah, of course, you might not have terms for medical terminology, or you might not have banking terminology in that language. But my point is that maybe that language isn't necessarily, yes, you're correct, that the narrowed domains of use from a putative, pure state where the language fulfilled every function, that's not the reality of a multilingual, multinational state, okay? So the reality is that for administrative and other purposes, the state is going to have its convenience factors there. And the linguistic market, in a sense, sort of dictates what the parameters are, that which the competitors in the game there might be. But the doesn't mean that the language, just because you can't talk about, can't file legal writs or whatever, can't have a medical journal written in the language, doesn't mean that the language doesn't have the full range of expressive functionality for almost every day-to-day things. And to be honest, not every person in the world needs to have those types of activities done. So some portion of people, yes, will need to have these full control of these functional languages that have local or national level purposes that they serve. But on the micro local level, there's no reason anyone shouldn't be allowed to continue to use whatever language for discussing micro local concerns. But
in multilingual societies, people do make these conscious choices, though, right? For example, I came across a Rajasthani language activist who said that because Rajasthani, for some strange reason, did not make it to the official list of India's scheduled languages, whereas Gujarati next door got that status. So the reality is that with Rajasthani language, you cannot, it's not a language that's acceptable in the political context. It's not a language that you can take your bureaucratic exams in India, which are all important, or apply for any government jobs, etc., etc., etc. And the result is that because most people in Rajasthan tend to be at least bilingual, they also speak Hindi and Rajasthani. Increasingly, they choose to speak in Hindi before their children because that's the language they want them to master, which opens up all avenues for them. Yeah. So his point was like, what have you reduced my language to? Yes, you've not banned it, but you've made it pretty redundant because you don't leave anything for us to do in that language.
Okay, that I understand his concern, but it's also a somewhat narrow understanding of use of language and use of language for identity purposes. It's not inherent in the restriction of the domains of possible uses, because it's not like Rajasthani had actual uses in those. It's just possible uses that might have been available to it because it was never afforded those functions. So therefore it didn't. And yes, it's a total historical accident that it wasn't. That and another variety was, okay? And it also underscores that large languages can be equally at risk by the disenfranchising and the language hierarchies that exist in a country as complex as India, as much as small tribal remote languages spoken by places and people in places that most Indians may have never heard of or certainly will never visit. So it's a that shows how strong these hierarchies are, that even a group like Rajasthani people can feel the pressures of this assimilatory process because they're so strong that they themselves are when they're millions of people strong, are able to be susceptible to that very same process of language shift, because the linguistic hierarchies are real. And there's almost no reason, honestly, to promote any one language simply because if the dynamics in place right now remain in place, people will start shifting to these languages because that's just what you have to do, because the ideology remains the same, the hierarchy remains the same. So every new group of people coming up are going to be subjected to the same pressures because nothing is going to change from that. And nothing, no matter how many scheduled languages they add, you're still going to have a hierarchy amongst them. No one is kidding themselves that Dogri or Santhali has the same status as Hindi as a scheduled language in India, okay? Not even the most ardent followers of those languages. So like there's a hierarchy even among the scheduled 22. Let's be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, and they have accepted that hierarchy subconsciously. Like they have accepted their mother tongue to be somehow inferior in this social hierarchy.
That's right, exactly. So they've internalized the negative valuation. And what do you do when you do that? You get rid of it.
Yes, exactly. And that's what results in this like fear of language loss. So the documented language loss, just as you said, like the languages that we have been established to have disappeared since India's independence, have been mainly like languages spoken by isolated communities, either the tribal groups or the coastal languages. But based on the study of factors that leads to this extinction of a language, do you think even these bigger language groups in India are at risk?
Assuredly, definitely. The ideology, a zero-sum game ideology of language diversity is toxic ecology. So we can turn to terms of linguistic ecology here. So the ecology for maintaining languages at the lower ends of the hierarchy is very poor. So obviously for the very lowest end of the hierarchy, you have relatively small groups, demographically small groups who don't have a large population base to start with, and may engage in activities that are frowned upon now for a variety of reasons, like gem cultivation or nomadic or semi-nomadic groups being settled or being restricted to forest access, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so relocated because of hydroelectric dam projects, where they're only affecting 10,000 people, but it turns out that 8,500 of those people are the 8,500 members of one ethnic group or whatever. Okay, so yeah, so on that level, it's just fully disruptive to their lives, even while it's serving an understandable need for a broader group of people. But that's almost like the death knell for a community to get disrupted like that. So now the larger communities, because of the fact that they're larger by definition, these demographically are larger, will likely endure longer or be able to resist longer in pockets to these pressures. But they're not going to be unaffected by them. So eventually they also will show large scale language shift predictably. So assuming the dynamics remain the same, and that's likely to be the case, then yes, even large languages in India right now are likely at risk.
But this seems like a little bit like at odds to anecdotally what we see. We see more media content generation across native languages now. The publication industry is booming, and then the TV channels and all of that is booming across all native languages.
The more media you have, the more coverage you have, the more people become aware of possible things that are affecting them that they didn't even realize they were participating in. So that makes sense that with an increased awareness of activism, you're going to have an increased desire by certain population sectors to maintain a language. Yeah, so that's good. And of course, state-controlled things are sort of a barrier that you may not be able to obviate, but non-state controlled moves and initiatives, and certainly technology, mobile technology in particular, has become widely available in lots of places. And so communities can start texting and doing other things sort of on an ad hoc basis, not waiting for a government program to develop so they just create a writing system. Maybe it's English based, maybe it's Devanagari Hindi based, whatever, it doesn't matter. So they just start doing things and they make ad hoc decisions, which organically develop over time, which almost all languages that became written languages did anyway. I mean, the stabilization of English orthography didn't happen basically until the early 20th century. If you look at stuff even from like the late 19th century, spelling's all over the place. So yeah, so
Indian languages have switched scripts many times over the century.
Yeah, and the scriptal politics in India are extremely complicated. So when people talk about dialects, back to your original question about dialects, part of the difference between in the Indian, like I gave a flippant answer, that's sort of a general perspective of language being something like a nation state, right? But with in the case of India, you find all kinds of sort of micro level processes that go against that. Anyway, if you have another question, you can. I could go on and on about that, so I don't want to.
So, no, I just wanted to ask, like, what do you think poses the biggest threat? So, a lot of people would argue that our languages survived 200 years of colonial oppression, and then since then 75 years of government negligence, which hasn't done really nothing to preserve most Indian languages, maybe except one. So if they could survive all that, and we still have, if as per the study, some number close to 800 or whatever that be, but still a pretty big number for sure, then why this concern now? Like, what poses the threat? Do you perceive the biggest threat coming from politics, economics, or technology?
I don't think those three are actually separable per se. They're all external factors to most people who live, just your average lifestyle in India, say. And again, like the colonial issue is an interesting one, and probably one that a lot of people will bristle at when I say this. But the British policy wasn't really to bring English to India. It did so at a certain echelon for administrative convenience, but they certainly weren't interested in having English spread downwards. So the actual impact of English during the whole entire British colonial period on the majority of Indian languages was negligible. It was more or less non-existent. So it was kind of laissez-faire, and they let these languages develop organically. It's actually in the last 80 years that things have become really bad, started to get bad. And it's really probably only in the last 20 to 30 years that things have actually started to decline quite severely. Just anecdotally, I see areas that I've worked in, both in Arunachal Pradesh and Orissa, where the kids are used to speak the languages and now really don't in the same villages. And you know, in the case of Orissa, of course, it's some kind of local Odia variety, maybe Desia, maybe another tribal Indian variety of Odia. But in Arunachal Pradesh, it's usually that local variety of Hindi that they speak there, the non-standard Hindi. But nevertheless, you know, there's an you know, anecdotal but still observable trend that in the same exact locales, that's 30 years ago, the people who are now parents who are speaking, who can still speak their language, the kids are not. So it's right now that actually the good news is that for the vast majority of endangered Indian languages, things haven't gone too far. We haven't gotten to the point where the tipping, you know, point has gone and it's no return, right? So there's still very realistic options for language maintenance and revitalization. And so, like, the logistical reality of a country as complex and diverse as India makes it unlikely that all of those languages could ever be served by centralized authorities. And so grassroots movements are really the only likely way. And they're so politics, of course, so then technology can become a pro as opposed to a vector of you know, of furthering shift. It can actually be as a means of fighting back, because technology is more equitably available through mobile phones than, say, government or economic policies or you know, activities which are more centralized. And so in a sense, politics and economics might be the purview of the top dogs in the hierarchy languages, but technology shouldn't have to be, because technology can be more, and that's just a matter of people like your Rajasthani friend just creating materials and disseminating them through social media platforms, through because again, state-run or, you know, fancily produced media is financially restrictive.
But doesn't technology bring about the same biases? Because if you look at technologies like whether it's social media or artificial intelligence, it bends towards the numbers, you know, like, so the more numbers are going to have the more influence over what we perceive on social, what we see on social media, or the AI is going to learn based on vast amount of data. So again, the larger
on a
language
macro level, yes, but not necessarily on the micro level. Okay, on the macro level, for sure, those forces can't be controlled. But it's actually, so, you know, a number of years ago, there was an American linguist who's now deceased who worked in Alaska, and he describes television as cultural nerve gas. It's only media, and because that television, this was a number of years ago, television was really the only, it was like the new medium. Radio and whatever was still, you know, established, but, you know, this was like, you know, well before the internet existed, or at least was widely distributed. So, you know, that struck me. Yes, that's true as long as people don't have access to controlling the content of these things. But today, things like YouTube mean you have access to control the content of locally consumable media. Okay, so you don't make it for the broader public. You make it for the public of this community of stakeholders that you're trying to serve. And previously, that would be implausible because television production costs, et cetera, no one is going to put in the money for that. But if it's zero cost and the only cost is basically the person who wants to do its time, then you have the ability to find a way to, and this could be done with, you know, also grassroots educational movements. You know, it's nice if you have state support, but if you can find a way to locally band together and get materials together and things like that, then there's no reason not to do it, because but it does that takes no joke level of dedication and effort by the language activists to see that happen. But we know that if they do, based on certain successes in other places, that will actually work and reverse the trend of shift and instill a certain amount of stability to the language and reinstore a little bit of ethnic pride, because no one's advocating for not using Hindi if you're in the Hindi sphere. Okay, that's just almost a reality that people have to accept, that Hindi has a certain status. That status isn't going to go away, and if you want access to the opportunities that Hindi provides, you need to learn Hindi. But it doesn't mean you have to abandon your language for singing, with songs with your children or whatever. There's no reason why you should do that. Those are separate realities.
I think in the cultural domain, we've seen pretty impressive resurgence of Bhojpuri, which pretty much lives within the shadow of Hindi, but has had a pretty tremendous success in the recent years. And I guess another language, Bhilli, which has also grown quite phenomenally without any political backing.
Right.
Economic backing.
It's because of people who are dedicated to doing it, basically, right? So they're just out there doing it and making it happen.
So I mean, it's probably some kind of cultural affinity and people willing to go to that, do that extra mile. But I wanted to ask, like, philosophically, in cases of where people themselves consciously drop their language by not speaking it in front of their children, and then it goes like, so it's not like that, it goes away gradually, and there isn't like a trauma which would normally come from a state oppression, like you were giving the example of Orissa, where the children have now started speaking some form of Hindi, or I was talking about the children in Rajasthan. So in those cases, like, isn't a sort of like a natural selection at play, that languages which are less adapted for their needs, people are subconsciously, societies are gradually finding those languages obsolete and just abandoning them? And should we then review the disappearance of those languages?
Okay, the twofold. Only someone who comes from and speaks a majority language would ever pose that question to themselves, really. And so that's I'm not blaming you personally. I'm just saying, like, that's the question of someone from the position of power. That's the thought. You don't even formulate that thought unless you have that privilege to have that thought. So that's the first thing.
I'm well aware of
it. Right. Well, I know that you're aware.
It's not a question that only I have. It's a question for like a lot of. So it's important to address, like, bring it up.
But again, this is all based on an assumption that, for example, communities that are discriminated against, once they speak the language, which albeit is not likely to be the most standardized and prestige form of that language, given the likely socioeconomic opportunities that are available to communities of lower status, that somehow will magically open doors of opportunity, and there'll be basically everything will change, and there'll be floods of wealth and opportunity into these communities. That has happened exactly never. So it's interesting that people continue to believe this, but there's actually no evidence that will ever happen, because it's just, so if it becomes your linguistic identity that's the alleged overt factor of discrimination, you get rid of that, then it will be something else. Oh, well, it's your religious identity, or you don't do the rites correctly, or your dialect of this language isn't quite right, or you don't quite have the right look. Sorry, so you're still, so they're just going to be a different vector likely to suppress and oppress, and the linguistic one simply removed, and all that's done is disconnected the community from their heritage, and so they're basically having to adopt and slot into a newly adopted heritage, rather than coming up with a blended heritage that says, I'm both an Indian citizen, I know this set of languages because of my Indian state citizenness, whatever that is, whether it's Oriya, whether it's Hindi, whether it's Telugu, it doesn't really matter. But I also am a member of X community simultaneously, so I can have multiple identities. So there's no reason why people can't compartmentalize different identities in different contexts and have different linguistic practices associated with those different context appropriate identities. So no one's expecting the Indian government to shift entirely to using Santali, even though it's one of the scheduled languages. Okay. As much as Santal people would love that. And it'd be awesome if everyone in India knew Santali. It's a wildly complicated language, one of the more complicated languages in the world. And, it's one of the great things to celebrate about India is like how complicated and wonderful some of these languages that are at risk are. So part of the multilingualism, if you step away from population management perspective, so from a bureaucratic perspective, and extrapolate this into other domains, would people be happy, for example, if there was only one type of food available, period? That's the only thing anyone could eat ever. Probably not. Most people would get, yes, it serves a utilitarian function. Yes, you have nutrition, but most people, if you had a choice, you probably, want to have 2 or 3 different things available to you to eat, or 2 or 3 different, it's like only being able to listen to one song ever.
But depends like what kind of analogy you use. Like if you're using a purely utilitarian example, like let's say the electrical sockets, then I would rather have the whole world have the same kind of electrical socket, so I don't have to.
So would I, right.
But so even multilingualism, right? Like, so it's easy to think of an example of somebody who speaks Rajasthani and then can also learn Hindi, and he can be bilingual, or even also learn English and be trilingual and operate perfectly well. But then there is multiple levels, right? Within Gujarat, as per the census, there is 50 languages. So those people would be learning their language and the Gujarati language and Hindi language at the national level, and then the English language for the international. So or like in Arunachal Pradesh, apparently there are 65 languages. So it's easier said than done. And even if we have governments which magically acquire compassion for the oppressed groups, is it even practical? Can the government actually allow or enable an environment which would allow sustenance of so many languages in the modern world, like where, like your example that you gave of the Odisha child, I think that's a direct outcome of the better connectivity within India now. We are all touching each other, so all these communities are getting impacted by each other and influenced. So it just seems like something inevitable, isn't it?
Well, that's a direct result of, in the particular area, of children attending school, because the school is basically an area.
And that's a really good example. Like, how does the state avoid that? Like, in terms of like,
well, to be a functioning member on the state level of living in Odisha, you need to know Oriya. Okay, so but that doesn't mean that, like my friend, my colleague from Orissa, he speaks Oriya, he speaks fluent Oriya, but he also speaks his language, and he speaks English. He doesn't have any problem. And he speaks Hindi. He speaks 4 languages. So he has no problem with that. Yeah, so four's not that many. I mean, for people who are monolingual, 4 seems like a terrible number. It's terrifying. But if you acquire them in the right contexts and for the right purposes, then it becomes, manageable. Like you mentioned Arunachal Pradesh. I have 2 good friends from Arunachal Pradesh who speak 9 languages. They speak a different set of 9 languages from each other, but each of them speaks 9 languages. That's what it is. I mean, I can fake my way through, more than 20 languages. So
argue that it would take an inordinate amount of time from education of a child if the child were to like study so many languages.
Well, you don't have to study them, right? The mother tongue should be, in an idealized situation, the mother tongue will be acquired in the family before schooling. A state language will be acquired through schooling. A national or transnational language would be required as necessary. So if your job is, working in the village level, then you probably don't need to know English. But if your job is, you want to be in the banking sector, you probably need to learn English. So like that, like it's if you have sort of niched understanding of the varied domains, you can still have this hierarchy of languages, or this sort of geographic, if you will, value or distribution of languages from local, very local, family level up to, village, whatever, market, state. There's different types of potential, options in there, up to national and transnational. That that's, again, it's served different purposes, and different people will, or so the major languages already have educational opportunities for them. You can learn Hindi, you can learn English. Okay, these are available one way or the other to people, and you can learn them even without formal education, right? You can learn them simply by consuming media in them, as many people do. But you still have the ability to, and as I said, the idealized situation, you acquire that mother tongue because the family is still speaking it on the family level, whether it's in a rural or urban setting. It doesn't matter what that is, right? It's still on that level. Because children will learn the language you speak to them in. Okay, even if they never talked back to you in it, they'll still understand it. A lot of children choose, once they get to school, to reject their heritage language because that's not the language of school. Some students do the opposite, and they reject school because the school doesn't have their language. So you get both things happening. So you get sort of voluntary non-education, and then you get people abandoning their identity when they hit the schools.
I feel like the way our schools are structured, like they almost dismiss the body of knowledge that is not in the official language of the school. Like it's not permitted, it's not entertained, like any concepts or ideas expressed in that language. Or
that's a direct consequence of the ideology of the value of the status of different languages. So yes, if the language has low status, why would anything in it be of value, right? So that's just a direct manifestation of the hierarchy.
Yeah, and sometimes I wonder, like when we say that language death is closely associated with cultural loss, like when a language dies, the whole culture dies. Sometimes I wonder, like if we get the cause and effect the other way around, like we get it wrong. Is it that the culture has already lost its appeal for whatever reason that people decide to abandon that language that is representative or embodies that culture instead of the other way around?
Yeah, I'm not sure you can really discern or differentiate meaningfully language and culture in that particular scenario, because if you're going from a monolingual initial state to a monolingual end state and passing through different periods of bilingual or multilingualism, it may be a chicken and the egg type of argument. So both perspectives are correct. In a sense, and both not quite adequate, if that makes any sense. So, right. So, cultural contact results in cultural change, but cultural change doesn't necessarily mean full abandonment of one for the other. That happens when you fully devalue your own identity and own practices, whether that's internalized or just beaten down in a sense, not physically, but emotionally from above through the messaging of this identity you associate with has no value in this context.
Right. And when people say they say that like a language is a unique world, has a unique worldview, and no two languages have the same worldview. So when one language dies, we lose something quite precious. Can you explain, like with an example, because that's usually one of the major reasons that's posed, like we should not allow these languages to die. They are quite precious. They are embodying. Like, what would be an example of like a worldview being embodied in a language?
Yeah. Okay. But it's a good point you're making. It's a commonly used adage, and it essentially derives from what's usually known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is that languages embody and reflect the cultural practices or the culture of a society. That you don't want to go too far with that if you're actually looking at linguistic data, because that would assume that, like, for example, a language that lacks gender, grammaticalized gender in their language wouldn't have any kind of gender-based discrimination in their culture, which is nonsense. Okay, so that they're on the most basic level, you can show that correlating a specific linguistic feature with a expected cultural practice isn't necessarily true across all possible instances. But there are certainly certain things, like, for example, a lot of languages don't have tense marking, and tense marking is something that people who speak languages with tense find very odd. Like, how can they convey information if they don't have tense? But what tense is tense is taking the event you're speaking about in relationship to the time you're speaking about it, right? So what you're focusing on is a relationship between the event and the time that you're speaking about it, right? Whereas other languages, what they're concerned about is how the action unfolded itself. Is it ongoing? Is it completed? This kind of thing. So they don't actually care about its relationship to the speech event. They only care about its relationship to the narrative event. And the narrative event is when that's what you call aspect in linguistic terms. So there's this big divide between languages which are tense, languages which have tense and aspect like English, or languages which only mark aspect. And then for people who speak only tense or tense aspect languages, to have the concept of aspect alone is mind-blowing. They can't even conceive of this. So it's hard for us to even put into terms like how that affects it certainly affects an understanding of what past or future means, because in one language group those are grammaticalized concepts, and so they have a relevance to communication. In the other group, they don't. Okay, so that definitely has some kind of knock-on effect in terms of how they understand at least the relationship of what they're speaking about to whom they're speaking about it to, because that's what tense does. Tense helps anchor what whether it's in written or spoken form. You're saying these are the relevant parameters of the speech event with respect to the event I'm telling you about. And aspect languages say, well, who cares what the relationship of this to the people you're talking about it is? All we care about is whether the event itself is, completed, starting and stopping, habitually done, has yet to be done, is going on, blah, blah, blah.
So what people give importance to in a culture.
Right, exactly. So yeah, and you definitely see in the lexicalization, that is what people talk about. It's very, very difficult often to translate specific terms. Like it's a single word in this language, but you need like a paragraph to describe it in that other language. But this is no different than technical jargon. So, in linguistics, we use words like phoneme and things. And this is like, it's a very complicated concept that you have to explain with many sentences to understand what that term is. But there you have, and in legal and medical things, people have these terms. And so any kind of jargon basically is an extremely specialized form of vocabulary and very context or culture specific. So a lot of people don't know these medical or legal or linguistic terms because they have no reason to know them, because they're not engaged in specialized conversations about them, right? So then it's
a coastal language may not have terms for mountaineering or snow and stuff like that.
Right. And even cardinal directions, right? Like some languages don't have
north, west, south.
Right, north, west, south. Yeah, the north, west, south, east. They have their understanding, for example, in some island languages that are spoken on volcanic islands typically have grammaticalized towards the mountain towards the sea. And that's the relevant parameter. In some riverine areas, it's upriver, downriver. In some mountain areas, it's up, down, slope, up slope, down slope. These are like the more salient parameters than anything else. So yeah, that sort of spatial orientation affects the way people think.
Also, I think it's interesting that in Hindi, we have the same word for tomorrow and yesterday.
It's always flummoxed to me, yes. I mean, I get how it's used. You use one with the future and one not, with the past or whatever. And then, so it means, one day from present.
Yeah.
So
I think it's
both directions.
Yes, most people would find it very puzzling that you would say the same thing. But so because you work with tribal languages like Munda languages of India and Siberia languages. When you interact with these communities, are they conscious of their languages becoming endangered or somehow being threatened?
Yeah, it depends on where they are on the continuum. Okay. So if you mentioned Siberia has very severe levels of language endangerment. Vast majority of the community has shifted to Russian now. And so they're almost always acutely aware of it. Because the older people, all speak the native language, and the younger people, none of them do. So this is like in their own family, their own household, they know that they're reminded every day that it's happening. Fortunately, in the Munda's context, most of the languages are still just starting out to be endangered. So I would say largely they're not, that is, the shift is starting now. This is the generation, the last decade or two, is the generations that are starting to
This is which areas in India where the Munda languages are spoken?
So mainly in Orissa and Jharkhand, and then some parts of West Bengal, and then
The tribal people.
Chhattisgarh, yeah, sort of tribal belt there. Sort of, you have one in the Chota Nagpur area or whatever in former Bihar, they're southern Bihar, but now Jharkhand, and then in kind of northern Orissa and southern Orissa, you have two pockets, and then there's the furthest, dislocated by many hundreds of kilometers to the west, is the Korku people, right in the sort of borderland between Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh. And then you have them in diaspora. So there's a lot of, for example, in the tea gardens in Assam, we've worked with, they often have these mono-ethnic or close to mono-ethnic villages working in the tea gardens. And so you can maintain some of these languages there, although unsurprisingly, in diaspora like that, the communities are more likely to be shifting. So there's a lot of people who are shifting to the what they call Sadri, which is the local tribal Indo-Aryan variety. It's a Hindi-based one, so it's not Assamese-based. Of course, people who go to school might be affected by Assamese in that area, but that's not that common. So they have loans from Assamese, but Sadri is the language that they're shifting to. So I have a colleague whose family several generations ago moved from Jharkhand to Assam, and so he no longer speaks his heritage language, but does speak Assamese, Hindi, and Sadri as well as English. So because that was the environment that he grew up in, that necessitated him knowing those languages.
And when I'm sure some of these like tribal languages in India are already dead, right? Like the great Assamese language, the great Andamanese languages are already gone. So right. I just want to ask you, like, what is your view on language revivalism? Do you think it's a futile, sentimental exercise or something more meaningful and important? And is it even feasible? Can a dead language be brought back to life?
Well, in some cases, it's quite feasible, and it's always valuable. And it's definitely not a pipe dream in the case of India, because, as I said, the tipping point hasn't been reached for most communities yet. It's not, on the downhill side where it's snowballing and it's never going to come back. So intervention can still happen now, today, this era, and bolster these languages. But for all the reasons that I said before, that's unlikely to be a state-controlled process and be successful, because the number of languages that need to be served in that situation is from a corporate understanding of expenses and this type of thing is implausible. So, but it doesn't mean that grassroots activism wouldn't be successful in those contexts, because they would. Now, why care? The main reason to care is that we see that in around the world where you can have the community that has invested some effort in maintaining or revitalizing their language versus a related one or identical one which hasn't. We find a lot of demographic things that states would like to be true of their communities, favoring the one that has made the effort to maintain the language over the ones that didn't. And this includes things like crime rates, drug and alcohol abuse rates, domestic violence rates, incarceration rates, like every sort of social demographic thing you would want is maintained. Now, from a multilingual perspective, and again, we're not looking at monolingualism as a concept typically in India, but with the hierarchies and ideologies in place, that's what it's moving towards, because that's what happens when you have these aggressive subtractive linguistic ideologies, is that ultimately population wants to shift to the language that is most conveniently being promoted by the power center. So it's hard. You can't really cherry pick these dynamics. Once you set them in motion, they're likely to just keep going to their logical conclusion, is the problem, right? Okay. So, but biomedically, what we see with bilingual and multilingual communities is the average onset of dementia is about 4.5 years later in bilingual or multilingual brains than in monolingual brains. So there's also a biomedical reason, which has burdens on families, burdens on state apparatuses, medical facilities, et cetera, et cetera. So if you look at all of the demographic and sort of biomedical things, that all is in favor of maintaining these languages, not doing them. So,
And like you said, like it would be impossible for any state to save or revive all of them. In your mind, would there be any factors that would make one language more worthy of the revivalist efforts over another?
okay, not from the community's, the community-centric perspective. No, every language has equal value to the community itself. Now, from a state manager's perspective, then of course you're going to find ways to rank and justify one over another. I mean, things like how many people still speak the language, how big the population base is, this kind of thing. Could teachers be trained relatively easily? Is there a sufficient, set of people who are competent speakers that could be trained as teachers or professionals involved in educational situations, et cetera? So, and those decisions will, of course, be made by people always taking the sort of corporate bureaucratic perspective. And so, as long as the decision making rests solely in those hands, then that's the inevitable outcome of it. Is that some will be served and others will be neglected. But that's why I was saying, because of the fact that it is equally valuable to everybody from the community perspective, there's no reason to not try to promote grassroots efforts where state efforts aren't going to, rise to the ability to support those languages for all of the biomedical and socio-demographic reasons I just said. Okay, so each language has a reason to keep it, but state decisions are going to impact what they do.
But you're generally okay with like some large language group being the official language for administrative purposes, for school medium of instruction, etc., because it would be impossible to have 800 languages in medium of instruction.
That's right. Yeah, it's a practical solution that makes, there's no other way really.
Right, but at local level within the community, for cultural purposes, people can and should continue with their.
Now, ideally, the language would be okay. Ideally, especially for the bigger languages, if you have several lakh population, you should be able to have teachers and educational materials in that language. Those languages should
be Punjabi and all, yes.
Right, or even a language like Sora in Orissa, which has like 400,000 or 500,000 speakers. That's or Korku, the one I mentioned in Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra, that's into the several hundred thousands, and some of the larger ones in Jharkhand, like the Mundari, Ho, these number in the millions. So these are all languages which are vastly underserved as educational media, but have no reason they shouldn't be, because they still have large numbers of speakers. So in that case, if I'm being honest, the state's probably failing the populations in those areas, even though they're making some efforts now. It's just that they need to, of course, in a lot of the rural tribal areas, you have teacher absenteeism and this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of problems just sort of inherent in it, but that's because they're basically not training local people to be teachers in the area. They're basically putting people from some other area who see those assignments as punishments or as, oh, I get sent to this tribal area instead of being exactly. So that
remote areas and all,
right, exactly. Yeah.
In places like US and Australia, conversations around tribal languages are finally getting national attention. As India becomes more well off relatively, and people come to, and just a natural thing is people start valuing their own culture and inheritance more. Do you see something like that happen in India in the near future, where there is more recognition and acknowledge and people start valuing these languages?
Yeah.
Tribal?
Okay. Well, more recognition and that I think is happening. Ganesh Devi is instrumental in having brought attention to this issue. So it's good that he's done that, and good that he's continuing to rattle the bell or whatever and keep people aware of the issue. Like, hey, it hasn't gone away; it's still here. So likely, yes, it will increase over time. Now, whether there'll be uptake over broad stretches of the population, who knows? I mean, again, here the power of media can be. So in the U.S., you mentioned the U.S., Spanish is clearly the second, the largest minority language, and people who are older still are kind of have a Spanish fear or whatever, but a lot of young people don't. in part because there was a popular cartoon character called Dora the Explorer, who a lot of little kids watched, who were now like young adults. And Dora was bilingual in Spanish and would speak Spanish a lot. And that instilled basically in the population, albeit in a subtle way, an acceptance of Spanish bilingualism as a reality in contemporary America. And I think there's a greater tolerance to it now among the younger people than there is among older people. And so, yes, societal change, of course, is glacial, but it can happen. The attitudes, I mean, you can look at this in terms of
But Spanish is not like an endangered language. What about like the
no, but yeah, but well, it's in America, it's quasi endangered insofar as, you know, typically after 2 generations, the immigrants' children are basically monolingual English speakers.
but it has a big base. Like there's
It
languages.
does. So immigrant languages are never the same as indigenous languages because there is
But what
no
about,
home country.
yeah, and actually, I would love to know like your thoughts on the indigenous languages of the United States, like the Navajo language or the Cherokee or those. How are they doing? Like because US has immensely more resources than a country like India towards conservation of languages.
Right, and there's more for federally recognized tribes like the 2 you just mentioned, Navajo and Cherokee. They have the ability to raise funds in various ways, whether it's through grants or through casinos and things like this, that they can generate, or large scale industrial projects of, you know, they control construction companies, logging companies, this kind of stuff. That's ways for them to bring in fair bits of money to help support cultural programs. And in those cases, when you find communities that have that federal recognition, which is a tough situation to get, and I mean, a large number of communities don't have it, but the ones that do have it benefit from it and can support their own cultural practices for sure. So, and
is the outlook better now for these languages?
I would say yes. They've probably, thus the same processes still exist, and so they still have to combat them, but they have them in the way to do so with any number of different means, the cultural language immersion programs for children and this kind of thing. Navajo has a media presence, so there's, you know, radio and I think television broadcasts in Navajo, and I know for a while they were doing Phoenix Suns broadcasts in Navajo, which is a NBA team, basketball team. So that is you know, so they have and here in Oregon where I live, there's the Grand Ronde Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde who've been supporting this language called Chinook-Wawa. It's originally a Creole language that was sort of Chinook and French based, and ultimately developed into the lingua franca on the reservation that because in Oregon they put a lot of tribes together in one reservations, and they'd split one tribe up into 2 or 3 reservations just to try to essentially, you know, put the nail in the coffin of these people's languages and cultures. So I mean, it was definitely orchestrated genocide, but nevertheless, a new language has emerged as that identity heritage language. And another group, the Silex, also a confederated tribe, they've been promoting what is an Athabascan language in their schooling, and definitely over the last, say, 20 years, I've seen it go from very little use of it to some kids getting pretty functional in the language by the time they leave high school. So, you know, that's a really nice thing to see. So yeah, some with the right amount of, but it costs money, as you pointed out, that costs money. Okay. So like, you got to have a way to generate income to support such programs.
And it's not just in the US, right? So we've even seen like in countries like England, like there is a revival efforts for Welsh and Irish and so
Manx.
Across, like, just to conclude, like, are there any lessons for India from the wider world when it comes to language conservation?
Yeah, I mean, India can, of course, develop a program based on all of the successes and failures that we've seen over generations. And because the country is in a situation where, as you pointed out, it's getting more wealth as a country. So there's more potential opportunities for support and help of these things. And certainly if they implemented programs, they would likely be successful on the ones that they do implement them for, because the fact that they're not so far gone for the most part that realistically sort of breathing some functionality back into them it's just a matter of allowing them to thrive in the domains they already should be in, and acknowledging that they have the right to exist in those domains. And then, the more people believe that, the more likely it will, make itself real. And once it does, then India has the ability to really be like a kind of beacon of light for showing what to do and how to address language diversity issues on a macro scale, because they could have a lot of successes, is my point. Is that so? Like they could promote successes and make people realize that it could happen, and then that would, success breeds success, as the old saying goes. So that's yeah. So that's
thank you for that optimistic note. So there is still some time. India still has time to prevent itself from becoming the graveyard of languages.
Right. But if it doesn't take actions, it will most certainly go there.
Right. Yeah. That's the warning that we should heed to. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you for the pleasant conversation.
And for everyone who's listening to us, also thank you for joining us on Argumentative Indian session. For decades, Indians were embarrassed about our large population, and it is only now that we are realizing that this human capital is going to be India's strength. Hopefully, before it's too late, we will realize that the large number of languages we have developed over the centuries is our cultural capital, which is not a weakness, but a strength. Thank you once again for joining Argumentative Indians.